We finished our other video talking about ancient DNA, and now we're going to talk about 1.3, Introduction to Languages, before moving on to 1.4. We are reading out of the Cambridge World Prehistory that was recently published in, recently published, trying to get the date, in 2015. It was published in 2015, the year I graduated high school. This section covers, again, Volume 1 out of 3, which is Africa, South and Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. And of course, it's about 700 pages long for each volume, so it's quite extensive. This Introduction to Languages is 30 pages long, and it's going to take a long time to get through Volume 1 as well as Volume 2 and Volume 3. But we're going to go ahead and get into this. We're going to talk about the introduction. It's titled Languages, and basically it starts out talking about how language can inform prehistory. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and start talking about language. To grasp how language data can support our understanding of the past, it is worth exploring an illustration, first from relatively well-known history, such as that of Britain over the last 2 millennia. Here, the linguist data are not only in close agreement with our historical knowledge on the series of processes, but they corroborate and indeed enrich that history with much detail and a high level of certainty in the inferences that can be drawn. Firstly, that before the Roman conquest, the Celtic languages were well established in Britain, and that while Latin did have some limited impact on Celtic there, it certainly failed to oust it as did on the European mainland. Displacement of Celtic soon was largely achieved, however, by a collection of Germanic tribes, mostly from the North Sea coast immediately facing England, where to this day the languages most closely related to English are still to be found, not least in the former lands of the Angles, who of course gave England and English their names. English betrays precious little contact with Celtic languages, but within a few centuries it certainly was impacted upon powerfully, especially in northeastern Britain, by speakers of Norse, arguably the trigger for some wholesale restructuring within the grammatical system of English during this period. Soon thereafter came a further impact from Norman French, itself ultimately descended from the Latin of the Roman Empire, but again, without replacing the fundamentally Germanic language lineage that is English. Every one of these different linguistic signals, and many more down even to the complex etymologies of individual words, is both explained by and constitutes additional evidence of the respective geographical origins, time depths, strengths, and natures of the Roman, Germanic, Viking, and Norman invasions of Britain. In short, what we observe in our languages today are the direct outcomes of what went on in the real world through the past. We have a cause and effect relationship. The basic principle is a simple one then. What determines the prehistories of language lineages and shapes how they relate to each other is none other than the set of real-world context and processes that impacted upon the populations that spoke them. This relationship is unambiguously one of the cause and effect relationships, and in a direction that is also ineluctable. Whether, how, and which particular languages diverge or converge is not just some natural law of what languages do or how languages evolve. Processes in the real-world context, demographic growth or collapse, migrations, conquest, or more subtle socio-political and cultural changes are the cause. They alone determine entirely the linguistic effects of divergence, diversity, and convergence. One particular interpretation of this general principle is, as its name suggests, Dixon's much discussed punctuated equilibrium model of language prehistories. Lest this cause and effect principle be misunderstood, we must immediately distinguish language change from language divergence. External forces do not normally determine the form and nature of whatever particular language changes arise. The detail of why Latin povit, for it rains, changed to plua in Romanian, plut in French, piove in Latin, and Nueve in Spanish and chove in Portuguese has precious little to do with archaeology or history. Even to linguists, while each of these changes seems phonetically natural, the detailed motivations for which happened when and where are largely unknown, and in most cases barely worth speculating on. Language changes can be highly idiosyncratic, and unless very specifically induced by contact, are generally either random or in line with other changes in the language system as a whole. Individual language changes then arise by natural linguistic processes, but it is external forces that determine whether those changes, whatever linguistic form they take, either develop independently and differently or come to be shared from one region to the next. In other words, real-world forces dictate not so much which particular changes occur, but the patterns of divergence or convergence that emerge from any changes. For it is external processes that govern which population groups and or cultural characteristics, language among them, do or do not spread at which times and in which ways and directions. They also determine how coherent or otherwise through time and geographical space are the populations that speak any given language lineage. In linguistic parlance, speech communities. Within the Indo-European language family, for instance, contrast how its Romance, German, and Slavic branches each diverge into its own great subfamily, while Albanian and Armenian remained as but singleton branches. The explanation is not a linguistic one at all, but simply echoes the contrast between, in the former case, the power of Rome and the forces that hastened its fall, and in the latter, the absence of such great expansive drivers. Another important clarification follows from the cause and effect nature of this relationship. Ever since Darwin, it has been popular to draw analogies between the origin and divergent histories of languages and those of species or populations, though, as historians of science note, linguists were in fact drawing trees of descent long before Darwin was. Such analogies continue into the modern trend to apply phylogenetic analysis algorithms, draw from the biological sciences to investigate the divergent prehistories of language lineages as well. But while analogies with biological mutation, selection, and evolution can prove helpful in some respects, in others they can be highly misleading. Languages are not genes, nor species, or cells, and they neither change nor diverge for the same reasons, nor by the same mechanisms, nor, for the matter, they are artifacts of material culture. Other than in some technical modeling applications, then it is unclear in what useful sense languages can be said specifically to evolve rather than just change and diverge under any selection pressure. There is no sense of fitness or on any meaningful criterion that can be usefully explain the various directions in which the multiple descendants of Latin changed and diverged in grammar, phonetics, and vocabulary. Changes may go about expressing the same meanings by different linguistic means, but it is a basic tenet of linguistic science, supported by the study of linguistic diversity worldwide, that all are essentially equal in their capacities to express whatever their speakers wish or need to communicate, irrespective of the particular means that their grammars or lexicons employ to that end. See the extensive literature on the linguistic relativity, as surveyed, for instance. Even if the rare apparent exceptions, like pig-gins, turn out to be more to prove the rule than to refute it. For particularly if a pidgin becomes a true mother tongue, i.e. a Creole, it tends to change at breakneck speed to acquire the same trappings that basic human communicative needs ask of any other natural language. That some languages seem more or less complex than others is quite beside the point, since so much of language's complexity is communicatively redundant. Traditionalists who extol the grammars of Latin or Sanskrit overlook that much of what they require for arbitrary correctness, e.g. gender agreements with abstract and sexless nouns, are but their own idiosyncratic conventions. They contribute nothing to communication that other languages, for example English, cannot either safely do without nor or express by other means where necessary. In the modern world, the power of literacy, standardization, the nation state, and even globalization may create the misleading impression that certain languages associated with those developments are somehow linguistically better suited than others to given purposes such as business or computing. But this is to see the cause and effect relationship the wrong way around, to mistake language for those other aspects of human society that are the real determiners: demographic, sociopolitical, economic, cultural. The leading international languages of the world owe their past or current status, and whether they already have established computing vocabularies in the first place, for instance, to the idiosyncratic prehistories of the populations that spoke them, not to anything intrinsically linguistic in them. Their future roles and fates as well will be shaped by geopolitics, not language change. To prehistorians, it is clear that there are limits to how useful the concepts of evolution and selection can be for accounting for the detailed trajectories and conflicts of human societies through time and space. Given the cause and effect relationship, those same limitations necessarily apply to evolutionary models of language divergent prehistories. The cause and effect direction also clarifies the relationships between the various disciplines with a stake in prehistory. The patterns that linguists observe and the relationships between our languages call out to be accounted for. The explanations are necessarily to be found in some processes underway in the past that must have significantly affected the populations that spoke those languages. Precisely the context that archaeologists, too, seek to uncover as well. Or to see it the other way around, our languages and their relationships are a source of data from which we might infer which types of process must have acted upon given populations through prehistory in order to best account for those linguistic outcomes. This then is how language relationships can provide a form of data on our past. Researching language prehistory, data, principles, and methods. Language data, both written and spoken. The forms that language data may take go far beyond the archaeologically obvious. Certainly, a number of the most spectacular advances in the study of our linguistic past owe their raw material to archaeologists. From Chinese oracle bones to cuneiform, linear B, different types of script, runes, and Mayan glyphs, the most direct record possible of our linguistic past is, of course, actual writing in languages long extinct or now radically transformed. Particularly in the Fertile Crescent, writing makes for an irreplaceably rich, albeit partial, record that takes us far back in time. Obviously, historical linguists make use of the earliest reliably attested language forms wherever available. Across much of the world, however, such direct evidence either remains tantalizingly undeciphered, such as the Indus Valley script, and there are a lot of different scripts that have not yet been deciphered. And so we have such undeciphered scripts that aren't even available. And while writing often ranks among the criteria invoked to define civilization, this remains controversial. The Incas, for instance, were able to administer their empire without any specifically linguistic form of record-keeping system, to judge from current interpretations of their Qipu knotted chords. In any case, even though written records are immensely valuable where we have them, they are hardly a sine qua non. Firstly, despite appearances in our modern literate societies, it is a linguistic truism that it is spoken language that is primary. Writing only ever, and optionally, follows as just a representation of spoken language. One certainly does not learn a language only when one learns how to write it. And of course, we're talking about our historical period now, where most people, the writing has been a very common phenomenon, while language has been around for a lot longer than that. Although we can use certain scripts that we find, and although that we have their written language, we do not understand their language because a lot of these scripts have yet to be deciphered. In any case, as with the speciation or the genetics of human populations, and again, we've talked about ancient DNA already, we're going to go through 30 more pages talking about languages and how they can inform our understanding of our prehistoric past in time. So, we do not necessarily need fossil evidence of all the missing links in order to begin researching the past. Of course, even where we have data only on present-day languages, by analyzing how they resemble or differ from each other, it is possible to infer the sequence of past developments that most likely accounts for the current linguistic patterns. It is perfectly possible to establish that a given set of languages all descend from the same single ancestor language, even when we do not have actual ancient records of it. Of course, we think back to the development of agriculture, which we previously discussed in our archaeology readings, that since the development of agriculture happened independently on about 6 different places around the entire globe, potentially it could be that way with language, and some of these especially prehistoric languages that developed about the time before the Neolithic Revolution, before the advent of writing itself. And so, it's perfectly possible to establish that a given set of languages all descend from the same single ancestor language, even when we do not have actual ancient records indicating it, as is indeed often the case. Linguists can work backwards in time to reconstruct such a proto-language, or at least some of its characteristics, to a greater or lesser degree of certainty. Even for past languages that are attested, in fact, reconstruction is still critical for filling in many gaps and uncertainties left by written records that are so often incomplete.